Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your patience. For those of you who were here since 8:30, I hope you had a chance to get a breakfast and a coffee. Thank you as well for those of us who are joining online. I hope you also got your little coffee before joining. So today, the seminar is organized by the Climate Change Initiative, ESA's Climate Change Initiative, jointly with Plymouth Marine Laboratory. So we will discuss Earth observation data and how we can use them to assess the state of the ocean. So to begin, I want to give you a brief introduction on who is organizing this seminar. So as I was just saying, this seminar is organized by ESA CCI Knowledge Exchange Training Initiative. So the purpose of which is to provide training events. So that is hands-on training using ESA CCI datasets, using Jupyter notebooks and showing them how to access CCI data and how to use them. We also have seminars, such as this one today, and also a series of competitions that we are in the process of organizing. I invite you to go on our website to find out more about these activities. So the audience is ranging from early career scientists to policymakers and also subject specialists. So there is a lot of things for everyone. You can find past seminars on this website, including this one will be recorded, and you can find it online as well. So I briefly talked about ESA CCI Climate Change Initiative. So they provide ECVs, so that is essential climate variables. And to give a little bit of more context of what these ECVs are, I wanted to show you this list of ECVs that are defined by the Global Climate Observing System, which defines 55 essential climate variables, of which 36 can be monitored from space, and the ESA CCI is actually generating 27 of them. So that is a range of physical variable or chemical variable that can be of critical importance to assess the climate system. So it can be atmospheric for the hydrosphere, describing the biosphere, and of course the oceans. And we have 7 oceanic ECVs in the ESA CCI, and actually there's one more project that is being developed, which Gemma will talk more about in a few minutes. And so I want to talk about the speakers now. So we have in person Professor Shubha Sathyendranath here with us. She will be here for the discussion. She is very well known for her work on marine optics and remote sensing of ocean color. She's actually the science lead of the CCI Ocean Color. And we have joining us online Gemma Kulk, who is also from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK. She's an expert in phytoplankton physiology and primary production, and she will be presenting a range of results of how CCI data help monitoring physical aspects of the ocean, biological aspects, including the ocean carbon cycle, and also emerging applications like tipping points. So in terms of the agenda, we will try to keep this talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion for 30 minutes. And because we have people joining us online, I will ask you to scan this QR code if you have any questions. You can also go on wooclap.com and enter the code UNOC 1006 to ask your questions. So I will give you a little bit of time just to scan the QR code to have it ready. Once you have a question, don't hesitate, you can ask it. And after the discussion, I will share these questions to Gemma and Shubha, who is here in person. And also, I want to tell you that we have the space until 10:30, so the talk and discussion will finish at 10 the latest, so you're very welcome to stay to discuss with Shubha or network and discuss further about the finding that will be shared today. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Gemma, who's online. Gemma, can you hear us?
Yes, very well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'll set up my screen. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation for us to speak here this morning. So Shubha and I both prepared this presentation for you, but I have the honors to deliver it this morning. We're going to talk a lot about the ocean and how important the ocean is for observing our climate system. To be able to do that, I first have to explain to you what the ocean's role is in our climate system. And as you might know, the ocean covers a large part of Earth. So that's about 71%. And I once heard if you look at the volume of the ocean, it's closer to 90%. What may be less well known is that the ocean is also the largest ecosystem on Earth. So it harbors a lot of life that is often not very visible to us. The ocean plays a key role in the Earth's carbon cycle. It is its biggest carbon store, and it's a really important sink of anthropogenic carbon emissions, CO2 emissions. So it's estimated that the ocean has taken up 25% of anthropogenic CO2 emissions in the past decades. That increase in atmospheric CO2 is leading to ocean warming, decreasing sea ice, and changes in stratification and circulation, and increasing sea level. So it has high impact on the physical state of our ocean. The long-term absorption of that anthropogenic CO2 is also causing ocean acidification. The pH of the ocean is changing, and it's really changing the drivers of the ocean carbon cycle. And I'll come back to that a little bit later, why that's important. When we look at life in the ocean, we know that phytoplankton, so those are small marine plants, are responsible for cycling a large amount of carbon through the marine ecosystem. And importantly, they help transport carbon away from the surface of the ocean to the deep ocean by a process called the biological carbon pump. And this is important because that carbon is stored for very long times in the deep ocean. So sort of mitigating some of the impacts of climate change. To be able to sort of understand all of this and understand the role of the ocean in our climate system, what we really need and what's essential is high quality and long-term observations. So we can assess climate and we can assess adaptation and mitigation strategies. So those observations might be a range of observations, but obviously today I'm focusing on Earth observations, and specifically on the ESA Climate Change Initiative. So as was just mentioned, the ESA Climate Change Initiative produces essential climate variables. So those are indicators that give us an idea of the state of the ocean. There are currently 8 ocean ECVs in the CCI program. 6 of those have been around for some time now. So those include the sea surface temperature, sea ice, sea surface salinity, ocean color, and sea surface level. There's also associated with sea surface level a sea level budget closure ECV. So that gives information on the various processes that contribute to sea level rise or sea level falling. And then there's one very new ocean ECV, which has just started last month, which is focused on phytoplankton carbon biomass and pigment diversity. And I'll come back to that one a little bit later. When we look at the data records of the CCI program, we actually see that some of those ECVs have very long data records. So the longest one is the one on sea ice, which now spans almost 50 years. and sea surface salinity being the shortest one at the moment. So these data records are really dependent on the satellite sensors that are available to produce those records. And obviously, when we look at climate and climate change, we want the longest time periods of our data as possible so that we can start attributing changes to natural causes or anthropogenic causes. And here, phytoplankton biomass and diversity is highlighted in gray because the data is not available yet. So that is yet to be produced. What makes these ECV products from CCI so unique? Well, one of the things I think which makes them unique is that the satellite observations allow for very high spatial and temporal coverage. So we can observe essential climate variables globally, often every day. And so they gave very good coverage of our climate system. The CCI also strives for consistency between products, not only within a specific data record, but also between data records. And they also look over the entire program for consistency between the approaches. So one of the things that most of the CCI products do is they merge, so they combine different satellite sensors together to get the longest time period as possible. They are designed and developed specifically for climate applications, which means they're long time series, but they also have a certain level of stability. And what that means is that there is a certain consistency within the products in the time series. So when we look at climate, we're not looking at artifacts of producing the data. And this is really important when we, again, want to attribute climate change. As I just mentioned, so these data records are often based on observations of multiple satellite sensors. So an example in the figure here is given for the ocean color data records, which now includes 5 different sensors, so shown across here, which are merged in one product. This is not an easy task because each of the individual sensors often have different specifications. So in ocean color, for example, we look at specific wave bands of visible light, and between the sensors, they're not the same. So there's a lot of work behind that to make these products consistent and to be able to merge those products. And this applies to most of the data records that the CCI program produces. And then importantly, most of the products are delivered with pixel by pixel uncertainty, which means that they have an error associated with them. So again, this is very important in climate studies to make sure that whatever you're seeing is not within the error of the product, but it's actually an impact of climate. And also throughout, I think CCI exists now for over a decade, so it has really high level scientific and policy impact, including contributions to the IPCC reports. So in the rest of the presentation, I want to show you some of the results that have come out of the CCI program. And I wanted to start with the physical state of the ocean and focus on 4 CCI products. So that tell us sort of how the ocean is changing from a physical perspective. The first one is sea surface temperature. So that's a data record for over 40 years now, and it's based on 9 infrared and microwave sensors. The next one is sea surface salinity. So salinity gives you an indication of how salty the water is. And this is the shortest data record in the CCI program. It's based on 3 L-band radiometer sensors. And it's extremely difficult to observe salinity from space. So again, this is not an easy task, but it is happening. And then the next one is sea ice concentration, which is a data record since the 1970s, so very long, and sea ice thickness, which has a data record since the 1990s. And this is based on many satellite sensors. So those are 14 passive microwave sensors. And then we have sea level data. And that's a data record from the 1990s and based on 8 altimetry sensors. What's interesting here is that they started developing a high resolution coastal product, which obviously is very important for sea level rise. So when we have a look at sea surface temperature, SST, the CCI data record shows that there's a 4-fold acceleration in temperature rise. And so initially this increased by 0.06 Kelvin per decade, which I understand doesn't mean much, but if we compare it to the 0.27, we see that there's a huge increase, so acceleration in warming. This warming trend is mostly linked to an increasing energy imbalance of Earth. And they've also observed that the short-term factors, so things such as climate oscillations, such as El Nino or volcanoes or solar shifts, they don't really impact or change the long-term trends. So there is strong confidence, high confidence in the sea surface temperature rise. And what is expected is that in the next 20 years, warming will outpace that linear trend. So increased warming is still expected. And so I think there is the SST teams trying to advocate that observations remain critical to monitor sea surface temperature rises. When we look at sea surface salinity, so there have been observations, not necessarily satellite observations, but field observations since the 1950s. And it's understood that so the saline, the salty areas of the ocean are becoming saltier, and the freshwater areas are becoming fresher. The CCI data record, although it's not very long, it already has had impact in how we monitor our climate. So it was very able to demonstrate some of the strongest and longest La Nina events. So La Nina is the little sister of El Nino. And so what they've demonstrated, so normally that's based on temperature observations only. But when you include salinity in global models, we're much able to predict El Nino events, so these climate oscillations. So I think this is a very important contribution also for understanding and predicting our climate systems. Sea ice, we continue to see ice. So in the Arctic, I think as we all probably know, Arctic sea ice extent and volume has been decaying. And we see strongest reductions in sea ice in late summer, so in sort of August, September periods. But actually, sea ice is decaying in every season since the data records. And so what this means is that it leads to younger sea ice, which is less stable and more mobile. And so we might see accelerated sea ice decay in the upcoming decades. The IPCC also documents that the risk of ice-free summers in the Arctic is substantially reduced at 1.5 degrees warming compared with 2 degrees warming. So it really remains important that we really try hard to reduce warming, global warming, as much as possible. Sea ice extent in the southern hemisphere actually shows a quite different picture. So sea ice has increased steadily until 2015 in the southern hemisphere. But again, here we show much lower coverage since 2016, which obviously is also concerning. And then sea ice level or sea ice melt does contribute a lot to sea level. And so we've seen that since the early 1990s, global mean sea level has risen by 8 centimeters, in part to ice melt, but also in part to thermal expansion. So here is where temperature and warming comes in. So when water warms, it expands and pushes sea level up. And there are some other causes that contribute to sea level rise. What's been shown in the satellite data records or the altimetry data is that the increase in sea level rise is accelerating. So this is something of concern as well. What's interesting in terms of sea level, that it's not rising everywhere. So there are differences globally or regionally, and sometimes sea level is falling. But importantly, in coastal regions, they experience 4 times faster sea level rise than the global mean. So that's again concerning because sea level rise matters most in those regions where people live, so in coastal regions. So that was a short overview of the physical state of our ocean, and I would now like to move on to the biological state of the ocean, where both Shubha and I do the majority of our work. And so how do we observe ocean biology from space? Well, we use ocean color for that. And so ocean color is literally the color of the water. When you look out at the ocean, you will see it's blue, green, it could be whitish, it could be very brown as well, depending on where you are. And so there are 4 major groups that affect the color of the ocean, which include phytoplankton, which are living organisms. Color dissolves organic matter, so that's a yellow substance. Detrital material, and then suspended sediments. So sediments might come from land, but they might come from tides or waves or things like that. And so here in the sort of photograph, the image on the bottom left, you see all sorts of colors that the ocean might have. And this is something that we can observe with satellites. Observing the color of the ocean from satellites is not easy. And the signal is often weak. And the atmosphere is sort of in the way, but which means that the atmospheric correction becomes very critical to be able to observe the ocean color very well. Obviously, I want to focus on biology. So I'm focusing on one of these groups that affect the color of the ocean, which are phytoplankton. So phytoplankton are marine microorganisms that photosynthesize just like plants on land. And it's also always striking, I think, when you think of microorganisms, it's not something you can see, but collectively they change the color of the ocean, and that's something we can see with satellites. And the first ocean color satellites were launched in the 1970s. Specifically to look at phytoplankton biomass. And that is based on a pigment called chlorophyll A, which is visible as a sort of greenish color. So within the CCI program, we have the Ocean Color Climate Change Initiative. And so again, this is a merged ocean color product. So I think in the past decade, slightly more, I think, a team led by Plymouth Marine Laboratory has developed the OCCCI products. They are intersensor bias corrected. So again, when you look at the different ocean color satellites, they have slightly different specifications. So corrections are made. They're error characterized, which again means that they have uncertainty estimates with them. They're climate quality controlled, which means that they can be used for climate studies. And we're now heading up to 28 years of the time series. So that's, I think, very impressive period of time. The OCCCI products have many applications, including climate applications. So I've just mentioned phytoplankton biomass as an example. And I want to continue with the ocean carbon cycle as an example, and then touch upon new applications, including tipping points. To look at the ocean carbon cycle, I think we have to have a quick look at the global carbon cycle first to understand where the ocean comes in. So when we consider the global carbon cycle, we have sources and sinks of carbon. So sources are obviously fossil fuels, but also land use and changes in land use. And sinks include those in the atmosphere, those on land, but also those in oceans. And the ocean here is given in a teal color, and you see how large the ocean sink is. So the ocean is really, really important in the global carbon cycle. When we look at the budget of the global carbon cycle, it's important to consider where the carbon goes. And so we have very good estimates of fossil carbon. So the carbon that comes from the use of fossil fuels. So that's one of the carbon sources that we can estimate really well. Land use change is another carbon source that we don't really estimate very well. So there is a big question mark on how large that carbon source is. When we look at the sinks, we measure the atmosphere, so we have good estimates for that. The ocean, we have relatively good observations and models, so there is some confidence in the ocean carbon sinks. And for land, that carbon sink is modeled, which means that the other five, so the carbon sources and sinks, become really important to estimate the land sink. And so this gives us reason to carefully look at how well we can do in the ocean. The ocean is not only a carbon sink. A lot happens in the ocean carbon cycle. And I realize this is quite a complicated figure. But I want you to take home from this that the ocean is not just a CO2 sink. Lots of things happen. There are many processes within the ocean that transform and alter carbon. I've highlighted here the ones that we can observe from space. So those are quite a few. So we have pools and fluxes. So the pools are on the left that we can estimate quite well using satellite observations. And then the processes, the fluxes, are on the right. So we're missing quite a few fluxes that we're not really able to observe with satellite observations. So how do we use the CCI products to observe the ocean carbon cycle? So the most important ones I would say are ocean color, to look at the biology in the ocean. And then the sea surface temperature, salinity, and sea ice cover are very important. We also make use of light, so photosynthetically active radiation. That's the light that's available for life below water. And I think when we when we talk about satellites, it sounds ideal, but we're very dependent on in situ data, so data collected in the field. It's not only important in developing our algorithms, but also validating the products. And so we have a range of input data from CCI, we have satellite-based models, and then we have a whole range of output data. And so those are fluxes in green and pools, carbon pools in the sort of purple color. So you can see there's a large dependency of multiple CCI products to look at the ocean carbon cycle in detail, which also means that it is important there's consistency between the CCI products. So we are able to estimate quite a few ocean carbon pools and fluxes from space. So we use satellite-based models for that. We also use machine learning techniques and then a combination of ocean color observations and field measurements to estimate some of those pools and fluxes. And here are just some examples. It's a taster of what this might look like. For example, phytoplankton carbon, because I've talked about phytoplankton before. So that's the carbon content in their cells. And another one that's related to phytoplankton carbon is phytoplankton is primary production. So how much carbon is taken up by phytoplankton. So there are, I would say, promising capabilities of estimating the carbon cycle from space. What we can also do then in more detail is determine an ocean carbon budget from satellites. So assign numbers to all of those pools of fluxes that we can observe from space. And so based on the ocean color and other CCI products, we can produce a high quality and consistent ocean carbon budget, at least what we call the mixed layer. So that's the surface of the ocean, where we would expect things to be uniform in a way. And again, here are some examples of what we might think. I'm touching on phytoplankton primary production. I realize maybe the numbers don't mean much, but 50 gigatons carbon per year is about the same as what plants produce on land. So it's a huge flux. So we often think the ocean is empty, but it's not. There's a lot happening there. An important question, I think, when we think about climate is the ocean carbon cycle changing? And that is a very difficult question to answer. And it depends on the carbon pool and flux you study and the data you use. So just to give you an example of primary production, we have over 2 decades of data from ocean color observations. And primary production is the synthesis of organic compounds from carbon dioxide, so CO2, through photosynthesis. So it's exactly the same thing as plants do on land. They photosynthesize and produce organic carbon for the rest of life. So phytoplankton primary production forms the basis of the marine ecosystem and is important for many marine resources, including fisheries. So as I mentioned, the primary production, global primary production, is about 50 gigatons carbon per year. And it kind of depends on which satellite model you look at, what that exact number is. So you already see at the global number, it varies a little bit. When we then look at the long-term trends in primary production, it's not globally, we don't see clear changes. We do see that primary production is decreasing in the open ocean and increasing in polar waters. But we're really dependent on what product we look at to sort of estimate in what direction of change is happening. And in large areas of the ocean, where you see the sort of light gray areas, there's no change at all. So it's sometimes very difficult to answer the question, is the ocean carbon cycle changing? And I think we should be careful with answering that question. I would say yes, in some regions, maybe globally, but I don't think we have very high confidence in terms of primary production at the moment. And then to finish off my presentation, I wanted to talk about some emerging new applications of the CCI program, and specifically about marine tipping points. Shubha and I recently started a new project on marine ecosystem tipping points. So often marine or ocean tipping points focus on the physics, and we're specifically interested in the biology. And we identified, well, we call them elements that might be tipping. So we have 8 elements that we are investigating. Most of them are related to phytoplankton, but we also have one element that's related to coral reefs. And what's important to understand is that a negative change in one element, so let's say maybe a species of phytoplankton, is almost always accompanied by a positive change in another element, so maybe another species of phytoplankton. So although there might be a tipping point, there's almost always something that's benefiting from that tipping point. So when we look at our project, tipping points in marine ecosystems, we are specifically interested in the concern that climate-related changes in some of the elements in the marine ecosystems may not be linear, slow, or steady. So the top figure here shows a linear change, so it's quite easy to set a threshold and then determine is an element, a marine ecosystem element, tipping or not. But changes might not be linear, and so the bottom figure here shows a much more complex system, which might have 2 thresholds that determine whether an element is tipping or not. And so we expect non-linearities in the system that could introduce acceleration of change, abrupt shifts, or changes in the recovery time when an element is changed. And so, as I mentioned, we selected 8 elements to examine the marine ecosystem tipping points using CCI data. So we're not only using ocean color data for that, but also the other CCI products, including, for example, temperature. And one of the example I want to give you, because it's related to biodiversity, which is an important topic at the UN conference, is changes in the phytoplankton species composition, the diversity of phytoplankton in the Arabian Sea. So the Arabian Sea is in the Indian Ocean, the northwest Indian Ocean. And so observations from the field are suggesting that the ecosystem is shifting from something called a diatom-dominated system to a Noctiluca-dominated system. And so why is that important? These are 2 different groups of phytoplankton. So diatoms, I think this is the wrong way around. Diatoms are autotrophic, so they only can photosynthesize. They're brownish-green in color. They use nitrogen, phosphorus, and silicate as their main food sources, nutrients to grow on. They have very high diversity, so it's a group with, well, I would say thousands and thousands of different species. And they're very important for exporting carbon from the surface to the deep ocean. And they also support fisheries. So I think people would sort of qualify that or quantify that as a healthy phytoplankton system. But what's increasingly seen is Noctiluca. So this is a mixotrophic species. So it can photosynthesize, but it can also use organic carbon directly to grow. They're often red and green in their color. So that benefits us. They have different colors, so we can observe the differences in ocean color. They don't need as many different types of nutrients, so they mainly use nitrogen and phosphorus to grow. They have relatively low diversity, so they're a single species. And they cause something called hypoxia. So they reduce the amount of oxygen that's available in the I'm saying that wrong. They increase the amount of oxygen in the water. And they are a harmful algal bloom. So this means that they have a negative impact on things like fisheries. So here again, one species might be tipping negatively, the other species might be benefiting positively, but it changes the entire system and it impacts marine sources. So that's one of the examples that we're going to study in a bit more detail. And that's it from us. So thank you very much for listening. We want to say a huge thank you to the ESA CCI program, also to the other ECV teams for providing us with information on their projects. And also thank you to the BICEP and SCOPE projects, which are focused on the carbon cycle. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gemma. And again, if you want to ask your questions, you can scan this QR code or go to wooklab.com. It will show in a minute. And I will begin with a few questions that I already had. So a lot of them are related to the part on phytoplankton. So there's a question which is probably for you, Gemma, asking how will phytoplankton change affect carbon sequestration capacity of different ocean regions, which I think you tackled this a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's not an easy easy question to answer. So what we see is that there are different things we see. We see that in some regions there's a positive change. So there's higher phytoplankton production, but in other regions we see lower phytoplankton production. And so typically higher production is associated with higher export, so higher storage of carbon in the deep ocean. What we're also seeing is that we are seeing a shift in the species. And this is important because phytoplankton are essential for example, fisheries. So if we find changes in the species composition, we might expect certain species to not link up with fisheries, so with the fish population. So there's a mismatch with the phytoplankton that grows and the phytoplankton that's food for fisheries. But we also at the same time might see that less carbon is exported because there is a change in the species composition or the biodiversity of phytoplankton.
On that note, there's also another question related to the impact on fisheries. So is ESA CCI working on those aspects, so impacts on socio-economic systems? Is it something that is being done within the CCI framework?
Shubha, would you like to answer this question?
If you would like to join us. You can come here, maybe? Yes, that would be better.
CCI is not looking specifically at fisheries. We're looking at phytoplankton and we're looking at the ocean carbon cycle. But as Gemma mentioned, there are links between phytoplankton production and distribution and fisheries. And there have been an lot of work done on how you can look at the implications to fisheries from changes in the phytoplankton distribution and dynamics. In fact, there have been a number of papers that have related the phrenology of phytoplankton in fisheries to. And this has been shown to be relevant for the nutrition, for haddock, for the oil sardines. The point is that when you have phytoplankton view, the larval stages of friction they rely on phytoplankton for the food. So if there is a change in the timing of these blooms, and it's a mismatch between the production of fish nadi and primary production, then it can have a detrimental effect. And that's being studied using satellites quite extensively.
Another question still on policy. Shubha, if you would like to answer this. So the question says, this work is crucial to national creating policies for climate change adaptation and mitigation. How do you work with countries and policymakers to share your impressive work?
This is in general?
In general, within the CCI Phytoplankton Ocean Color project, are there links with policymakers to share the work that you're doing?
That's a really broad and difficult question.
Indeed.
You find different ways of doing. We have, for example, contributed to the IPCC reports. We work with organizations that are responsible for the ocean decay. We try to engage with the local governments, national governments. It's a never-ending job. And I see that, and I was glad to meet some of them. There are some NGOs present here. Sustainable Ocean, and INS. So I think those people also have a very important role to play. And ultimately, policy is determined by us because we elect governments that make the law, make the rules. So if we are informed as a common person and we influence the government, then eventually change will happen. So I think in influencing policy, it's not something that should be dealt by just CCI. It's a task for all of us.
Thank you. There's another question, I think, for Gemma. So what factors are causing primary production to decline in open oceans but increase in polar waters? So this relates to the graph that you were showing, I think, in your latest slides. Yeah.
Yeah, so the open oceans are sort of the deserts of the ocean. There's little life, but there is life. And so the main controlling factor there is the availability of nutrients, so food that phytoplankton use to grow. And what we see when the ocean surface warms, there's huge stability in the surface. So once phytoplankton starts to grow, they use all the nutrients in that layer, that stable layer, surface layer of the ocean. And because that's so stable, nutrients from lower waters, colder waters, they can't come up. There's a sort of barrier between warm and cold waters. In some regions between the sort of open oceans and sort of more northern and southern regions, we see that winter mixes the water column quite a bit, and so nutrients are resupplied to that surface ocean, sort of supporting phytoplankton growth in spring. And so we see that region of stability is sort of increasing, and so reducing phytoplankton primary production in the open oceans. When we look at the polar regions, phytoplankton are often limited by light, so the availability of light and possibly temperature. So especially in the Arctic, with the reduction of sea ice, phytoplankton have a larger area to grow in. Obviously, light is really essential for photosynthesis. And a cover of sea ice, although there's growth of phytoplankton under sea ice, you can imagine the light levels are much lower than when you don't have sea ice. And that sort of uptick in temperature makes the growth rate slightly higher. So you see huge changes due to light and temperature in the polar regions.
Thank you. And to complement what you were saying about policy applications of CCI data, there's Roberto Sabia joining online, who's also from ESA, who wanted to complement, saying that there's another CCI-related project, which is not within the ECV series. It's called Ocean Carbon for Climate, and it has a focus on air CO2 fluxes to address climate policies. So if you want to have a look at it, you can also go to the ESA CCI website, the ESA website, sorry, to learn more about this project. And then we have a few questions on the timing of the data sets, one of which is if there are real-time observations of productivity changes.
So at the moment, no. I would say the CCI program is really focused on the long-term climate quality data sets. So they're not operational data sets. They're looking, for the longer periods. Some of those products are produced operationally. So on very short notice. At the moment, primary production of phytoplankton is not one of those. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything, Shubha.
One thing to add is that, CCI is a climate quality product. So there is always a lag between when we produce the data and make them publicly available and when from the time when it was acquired. Usually it is a 3-month lag. And the reason is that we go through various levels of quality control and checking before it is added to the time series and released. The question is about real-time products for real-time applications, operational applications. We don't do that ourselves, but the Copernicus Marine Services, they do produce a time series for operational applications, and you may want to check that. CMEMS might have an operational primary production product. But always those products are produced rapidly to serve a user who needs it in real time, so the quality may not always be at the same level, but it might be sufficient for many applications.
Thank you. We have a question on the models used for primary production. There seems to be many types based on chlorophyll, absorption, carbon models, and so on. How can we determine which model performs best or is more reliable? So maybe that's a question for you.
Yes, there are many models. I have also spent a lot of time looking at the differences between models and shown that actually those models are very similar to each other. But you always make certain choices depending on where you think the minimal errors might be. And the differences arise mainly from that. But whichever model you are looking at, they all have certain basic properties. They all recognize that primary production is photosynthesis in an ecological context. So you need light, and you need and something that interfaces with the light. Whether you're dealing with land or ocean, that material actually is chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is what you can detect from satellite. And then you need nutrients. Based on that, you get production. So these basic principles are embedded in all the models, but then models require parameters. And it is in the assignment of parameters that you begin to see differences emerge. There is also another source of difference. that is arising from the spectral quality of light. Phytoplankton or terrestrial plants, they are not able to use light at all spectral frequencies equally well. So if there are models that take into account this spectral differentiation, then I do feel that those models have an advantage. As someone who produces the models, one of them myself, I wouldn't like to say that we are the best. So it's up to you to learn and decide. But obviously, if I didn't think this was the best one, I wouldn't do it myself.
We have another question on that topic, a little bit broad. How do you reconcile discrepancies between satellite and in situ data within the models?
Everything or?
In primary production models. Or maybe everything.
How do you deal with discrepancies? I think we work the other way. We begin by looking at the actual in situ data, and we look at the models. We see to what extent the models are able to reproduce the observations. We try to understand where discrepancies might occur. Then we try to explain the discrepancies, and remember that while we are doing it, we also have to remember that there are errors in observations as well. So we try to take into account of that. It is when you are satisfied that you have a decent model that you take the next step of applying it to satellite data. But once a model has been applied to satellite data, you do go back to in situ data to compare. But when you are comparing them, again, it's not an easy task because point observations from in situ observing platforms, they explain what's happening in a very small volume of water. At best, a cubic meter in surface area and then through the water column. Whereas the satellites are averaging or integrating what's happening over much larger spatial scales. A single pixel might account for 1 square kilometer or less or more, depending on which satellite sensors you are using. So you have to take into account these differences in the spatial and temporal scales when you try to compare the two.
Thank you. There's a question to which I actually can answer. Where can we access the data? That's climate.esa.int. You can download them or have them if you are using some software such as Jasmine data.
Jasmine is the platform where we mount, yeah. But all the data can be accessed through CCI webpage. They're all openly available, not just the ocean color, but all the CCI products are freely and openly available. I can access it through the ESA CCI website.
Yes, and within the CCI Knowledge Exchange project, there's a toolbox being developed, so that allows you to access this data in a more, in an easier manner. So there are functions that are being developed to allow you to plot these data sets easily without knowing too much about Python. I invite you to look at the CCI toolbox in more details in the climate.esa.int website.
There is also another website that we host at PML. It's called oceancolor.org, but you have to remember to spell color the English way with a U in it. There is another website maintained by NASA, oceancolor.org, without the O, and that will take you to all the NASA products, and they are also outstanding products.
We have time for one last question. So we have a question on geoengineering, so that's related to methods such as ocean iron fertilization, and the person is asking if they could trigger marine tipping points. And there's research on it within the ESA CCI framework.
The addition of iron as a mitigating mechanism for climate impacts has been around for a long time.
And I think the results so far have been mixed. And there is also a fear that when you add iron to the system, you might be shifting the ecosystem from say, a small cell-dominated system to a large cell-dominated system, which may have unknown impacts on the marine ecosystem. The environmental conditions at the time of the iron fertilization can also determine how effective the mechanism might be. The other thing to consider is that the high nutrient, low iron, low chlorophyll systems are typically very far away from the coast. So you have to invest energy and fuel, I imagine, to get a ship to carry the iron to these distant locations. So that will be a negative effect. But at the same time, this also comes under the Convention of Ocean Dumping. And the London Convention on Ocean Dumping has actually said that they don't support the idea of iron fertilization except in a very limited sense for research. So the jury is still out there on that one, I think, as far as I know.
Thank you so much, Shubha, and thank you very much, Gemma, for this very interesting and thorough presentation. We will now end the seminar, and for those who are in person, you are very welcome to stay until 10:20, and we will end here. Thank you so much for your participation.